let's get straight to that big story. The international community is watching the US elections, which got underway earlier today with great interest, as President Barack Obama and Senator Mitt Romney squares off in what many punters are calling one of the closest presidential election races in recent times. Of course, the outcome of the results impact far beyond the borders of that country. And to take a closer look at its implications for Africa, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Adam Habib. He's the Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Johannesburg. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. The first election results, which came through in New Hampshire, earlier today, broke down in a straight-down tie, 50-50, and a lot of analysts are saying this is a portent of what's to come. Is this race as tight as the exit poll seems to suggest?
I think it is. I think it particularly became much tighter in recent weeks when Mitt Romney particularly began to cast a more moderate image and a more moderate line that came out, and so he's made it a much tighter race. I also think that while Obama has performed at some levels, he's disappointed his supporters at other levels, and clearly last night he acknowledged that. In the last few days he started saying, look, I know that you don't entirely agree with all that I did, but I'm the best you have. And I think that that's the message, that both those moves have particularly made this a particularly tight race.
Now, of course, the big issue is that Obama is well known, in many ways celebrated for being the first black president in America. Romney is a bit of an unknown. He's already shifted to the center, away from the kind of right-wing elements within the Republican Party, like the Tea Party. But is there, in terms of foreign policy, for example, going to be any really key differences should Romney pip Obama at the polls?
Look, I think there's going to be differences. There's definitely going to be differences. I'll tell you what worries me about the debate. If you listen to the debate, particularly from the African continent, the question is, what can I get? What can each of these candidates do for the African continent? I think that's a particularly colonial mentality. I don't think Africa should be about what we're going to get from each of the candidates. I think if you want to understand the implications of this election on the African continent, you have to understand what is the systemic impact of a Romney presidency and an Obama presidency. And I think if you tackle it at that level, there are two fundamental differences. I think the Romney presidency has a dramatic impact on the nature of on the economy. The Romney presidency is unlikely to take inequality as seriously as an Obama presidency would. I think a Romney presidency is much more harsher, much more macho, much more, if you like, militaristic when it comes to a foreign policy agenda. It is less considerate of world opinion.
Let's come to the issue of economics. Traditionally, Democrats are protectionist, but we've seen under Obama a GOA that inherited from the previous government being implemented with huge benefits for a country like South Africa. We know that the South African ambassador in the US, Ibrahim Rasool, has already put together what is called a war chest to go and lobby Congress people, irrespective of the outcome. And there's not a lot of expectation that things will change. But if one looks at the Republicans during the Bush era, there was a lot of aid coming around AIDS, for example. And of course, the Republicans were conservative, tying, of course, the money to a whole range of preconceived ideas around women's reproductive health, the issue of abortion, and so on. Do you see the Republicans doing things differently should Romney come to pass, particularly on an economic and social agenda in Africa?
Look, I must say that I do think that in a lot of ways Bush was very good in terms of giving a far greater level of resources. I think it came with conditionalities. And often people then thought, because Obama may seem slightly left of center, therefore you're going to get generated many more resources. I think that's the wrong way to watch it. I think the big issue that you need to understand, the dramatic implications of the Bush presidency, was not how much money he gave, but the questions of what is the economic footprint that the US engages in, and what are the ripple effects in the world. The shift from a Reagan presidency and the implications of that in the large parts of the world had dramatic consequences. And for me, this notion of inequality, this notion of fully being responsive to market orientation, being much more tax oriented, not focusing on the interests of the really particularly rich and not the middle classes or the working class. I think those have dramatic implications. We've seen the consequences of that in 2008, in 2009. For me, that's the ripple effect.
Let's bring it back to the issue of security, particularly on the African continent. We've seen Islamist violence, particularly to the north of our borders. We've seen it in places like Kenya, Nigeria. We've got, you know, Sudan, South Sudan, quite tenuous relations. Obama has generally kept a very kind of, you know, below the radar kind of approach, not very interventionist. If Romney comes through, are we likely to see a more aggressive security presence from the US, given the fact that the Republican Party does appear quite, you know, macho and bolshy on issues such as security?
I think you can be absolutely certain that that's going to happen. I think the war on terror and the foreign policy imprint of the war on terror has had dramatic consequences in places like Somalia, Sudan, Darfur, large parts of the Middle East, etc. I think what it's tended to do is militarize countries that would, under normal conditions, not have had that case. The developments in Kenya and the attacks in Kenya are an example of that. What has happened in Pakistan is an example of that. Is it likely that an Obama regime will be fundamentally different? No. I do think he'll be less obvious. I think he will be less engaged on the African continent. I think drone attacks in Pakistan are going to continue, and I think that they're going to create all kinds of ripple effects. But I do think Obama is no saint. But it's worth bearing in mind that a Romney presidency or a foreign policy imprint would be far more militaristic, far more oriented to a war on terror, with dramatic imprints on particularly the African continent.
Let's take it back to the US. It's been said by all the punters that the deciding factors are going to be those swing states, places like Nevada, Ohio, where voters are still kind of undecided. What do you think will be the tipping factor that will lead to Obama losing this election?
I think his own base not coming out. I think that's the fundamental issue. People are often saying it depends what Romney pulls out. I don't think it depends on what Romney pulls out. I think is, will Obama roll out young people in a big number as he did in 2008?
Oh, they were his base.
That's right. People are worried about it. I think he's got the African American community. I think he's got a footprint in the Latin American community. I think the big question is, will young people come out? I was quite struck by, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Bruce Springsteen popped up and said, I stood on a podium. 2 months ago, Bruce Springsteen wasn't prepared to do that.
Well, he's not young, hey, Adam.
He isn't, but he does represent the union base of this thing. So can you pull out the union base of the Democratic Party? Can you pull out young people? Those were the two sectors that were particularly disappointed with the Obama reforms post-2008. And that's the base that I think he was appealing to in his last days when he said, I didn't do everything you wanted, but I did more than a Republican president would. And I think that's the base. If those people turn out, I think Obama's got a second presidency. I think if they don't turn out, we might very well have a Republican in the White House.
Well, we'll have to leave it